Wawan, pictured here, used to live on the banks of the river Bengawan in Solo with his wife and 2 children in what was deemed an illegal settlement. Every year, his settlement would flood, causing damage to homes and concern for local authorities. He lives on the margins, without legal tenure, and in areas of social and physical vulnerability. What made matters worse was that while the government was aware of his situation, he was not registered as an official citizen, and so government was never able to respond to his situation or address his needs. How do you think of a city? Is it the people, the buildings, or is it the spaces in between, like parks and public areas? For me, it is the people who live on the margins, off the grid, along riverbanks and railway tracks and in poor settlements. For many cities in the developing world, these people are hard to identify and to count, but their numbers and contribution are great. They have been at the core of my work. It is easy to forget that everyone in a city is important. Everybody contributes to the economy and culture. Everybody has dreams and a voice. But hearing that voice is often very difficult. We don't always know who they are or where they live or what needs they have. At the scale of the city, people's needs are expressed through elections. Recently in Indonesia, we had presidential elections, and that's certainly an important way to make oneself count. But at the margins, there are many people who are outside of societal processes like elections. They may live in areas that lack access to what we think of as basic city services, such as healthy conditions, water, and safety. They may not also be registered as citizens. In such conditions, without land tenure, without access to water or safety, we see that there are 2 cities, the official city and the shadow city, the city of citizenship and privilege, and the city of those without access, those who are on the inside and those who are left outside. Now, for many reasons, this is not good for society. First of all, I believe that a society should be judged by how well it treats its, not by how well it treats its most wealthy or privileged, but by how well it treats its most vulnerable and least privileged. Secondly, by developing the needs of these people will help us to all develop. And by recognizing and supporting the poor, we're able to improve the lives of us all. Really, there is no other way to make our cities healthier, safer, and more prosperous. Recognizing everyone in a city is one way to start to grapple and understand with what people's needs are, and in doing so, help them assert their rights to be included. Indonesian cities are notorious for lacking information. Every censuses only occur once every 10 years, and official data is often not credible, not shared, or very difficult to access. In Jakarta, for example, the 30% of the population, or some 4 million people, live in informal settlements called kampungs. But this is at best speculative. Nobody really knows. Official data about access to water and sanitation is also difficult to access. Now, I started to work in Solo, in Central Java, in 2009, and I wanted to better understand where people lived and what needs they had, especially those who were not officially counted. I started an NGO called Yayasan Kota Kita with some activists, and we were fortunate enough to work with the Mayor, Joko Widodo, now President of Indonesia. We set about to collect information. Now, I was walking around the city and started to recognize, I started to notice these little signs that were on the corner of every street and lane. I recognized that this was an organizing system of the city and one that operates in every Indonesian city. Through it, every 20 to 30 houses are grouped together in what is called an RT, or a rukun tetangga. And each one of these RTs has an elected head or an RT leader. Now, the origins of this system are interesting and curious because it was first implemented during the Japanese occupation, and it was used in order to monitor and to control people. It was then used again during the Suharto regime in order to do much the same. What we wanted to do was to reappropriate this, but instead of using it to control, we wanted to empower people. So we started with one neighborhood and started to map the area and speak to each of these RT leaders, asking them questions like, how many households are there in this RT, and how many of them have access to water or sanitation? And in doing so, we were essentially crowdsourcing information from the city. In 2010, we went from one neighborhood and scaling up to the level of the city, which is 51 neighborhoods that covered some 3,000 RTs. This process took us 4 months. In 2012, when we did this process again, we stumbled upon a tool called the SMS Gateway, which allowed us to send questionnaires through SMS messages. Now, for those of you who live in Indonesia, you may recognize that for many people it's difficult to access services like water and health, but everybody has a cell phone. And so through this, we were able to reduce the amount of time it took to collect information from 4 months to 2 months, and in doing so, increased the accuracy and also reduced our costs. This year, the local government is collecting the data alone. So while it was important to organize and gather the data, we also wanted to make sure that people could understand and relate to it, and that it was accessible to them. We experimented with ways to represent information in a way that was fun and easy to use. And so we designed what we call mini atlases. Now, a mini atlas presents comprehensive information in a comprehensive format in a way that tries to make it visual, but also so that people can relate to it. In the top left, you see there's a little description about the neighborhood and its characteristics, and also little demographic information. On the top right, there's a list of some of the challenges, or also some of the assets and positive parts of the neighborhood. And we also present a map which locates different community facilities and infrastructure, such as schools, mosques, and community centers, which people can use to point at to understand how issues relate to them. The bottom, there are different thematic sections which help to provide information about different issues such as housing, health, water, sanitation, poverty. Here is an example of one in which you see where poverty concentrates in the neighborhood, and visually represents this, but also the way in which poverty in the neighborhood might relate to the rest of the city. What we did was to make this invisible information visible. And in doing so, we were able to tell a story about inequality of access in the city. Now, these mini atlases are poster size, and they're meant to hang in community centers or information kiosks, or be used in community meetings. And what they do is, for families that may not have been counted, now they're at least able to use them to point at where they are and how issues might relate to them. They've been used over the last 5 years to help guide the city's participatory budgeting cycle, and in doing so, able to facilitate this discussion about their needs. Basic information offers evidence that makes them and their issues visible, and so it literally puts them on the map. Here is another example of how it is used at this very small scale level. Now, once the system was set up and working, we were curious to know if it could help support other decision-making processes in other cities beyond Solo. At this point, we received a curious and unexpected request from the city of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. When I first arrived, the snow and brightness were really disorienting. They reminded me just how far I was from Solo. The fact that the temperature had dropped some 70 degrees literally was a reminder of this feeling. I wanted to see and to test whether really the collecting and gathering information would be something that could support communities that were nomadic and who didn't speak the same language that I did, and many of whom had just recently moved to the city themselves. And so it was in this context that, or at this moment, I met the Engtuya family. Now, there are 7 of them who live in this ger tent and had just moved to the city from the countryside and live on the very outskirts of the city. While they do have a legal tenure to the land, they live without electricity or water, and they live far from transport, schools, and health facilities. I thought to myself, if this family could be put on the map, then surely the government would be able to plan and better provide for it. And so it was in this context that Kota Kita was asked to collaborate with the Asia Foundation and the Mayor's Office in order to undertake a similar process to what we had done in Solo. We worked with citizens and community leaders and city officials and collected information from first 1 and then 87 different neighborhoods that surrounded the city in what was a staggeringly large area, so included some 800,000 people. You see here an example of a neighborhood profile, and shows where they are in relation to where people live. The mayor commented that it was the collection of data through this approach was far more accurate than official government population estimates that were outdated, and as a result, were not able to recognize the need for basic services. What that meant for the city was that growing demand for water, transportation, health, and education facilities was not being recognized and not being responded to. So what these maps, what these profiles and maps meant for the Engtuya family is that their newly established home in the city was being recognized not only for what it is today, but for what it would be in the future, part of a functioning neighborhood and part of the city. The mayor made it a policy that these profiles would be present in discussions between citizens and government about identifying areas of projects and investments. And they helped to show that the fast-growing areas of the city required new services to keep up with newcomers and demand. What was very interesting to me is that in some of the neighborhoods that we had worked in both in Solo and Ulaanbaatar, community organizations had sort of used these maps and started to appropriate them in new ways. In one neighborhood in Solo, their tourism committee took this information and made a travel brochure which they would use to promote local crafts. And in Ulaanbaatar, another community organization used some of the risks maps to create evacuation routes in cases of emergency. Pak Wawan now lives in another neighborhood in Solo where he's been moved by the government in order to reduce his vulnerability to flooding. He has better infrastructure, he has land title which he's able to use for collateral to apply for loans. His children have scholarships to local schools. Importantly, he's on the map, visible to a local government that is working to improve services to his family and community. He's also, importantly, the community mapping initiative has shown that wherever he is in the city, he is a part of it, and as so will be recognized and counted. Thank you.